Practice questions review for skill acquisition and biomechanics test. Start straight away. So, the first question we're looking at, Stephanie Gilmore is a 4-time world surfing champion. So looking at the concept of visualization. So the first question says, using a sporting example, explain one way in which mental practice can improve the performance of the player who's in the associative stage of learning. So I've looked at mental practice allows the associative learner, remembering associative can't really deal with opposition players as yet. So this allows the visualize successful subroutines. This will be able allow them to be able to visualize successful performance before they have to deal with external pressure. Second question is explain one factor that is necessary for a mental practice to be effective. So we know that mental practice, to be effective, the learner already has to have a level of consistency with their technique and execution of performance. So the associative learner, they may completed successful subroutines or performance without pressure, and they can draw on that to use as mental rehearsal so they can then move potentially into the next phase of their development. All right, next questions. So we're looking at goal setting. All right, so Stephanie Gilmore's goals includes aerials in her surfing regime. All right, so effective goal setting requires goals that are achievable, specific, measurable, set in a time frame, and realistic. So using a sporting example, choose one of the requirements listed above and explain how it contributes to effective goal setting. So I've written achievable, so that allow athletes to be able to meet the required goal, which could increase motivation for the athlete to engage with training, so skill and physical, and help them progress further from that achievable goal. You could also look at measurable. Many surfers make errors in their attempt to perform aerial maneuvers. Explain the difference between elite athletes and beginner athletes in their use of kinesthetic feedback to eliminate errors. So we know, based on autonomous versus cognitive learners, beginning athletes cannot use kinesthetic feedback. So they do not understand what is the right and the wrong technique. They haven't got the feel for the technique, so they need external feedback from coaches to help refine that technique. Or autonomous or experienced athletes can use kinesthetic feedback based on previous skill execution to aid the elimination of technical errors. All right, question 8. Looking at this diagram of summation of forces. So they're saying refer to the following diagram which shows the timing involved in the sequential summation. So we can see that diagram 1 has really solid sequential summation, where diagram 2 has a longer period in the shoulders, which you can see the velocity is below where diagram 1 is by the time it gets to the wrist. So Question A says the sequential summation of force is a biomechanical principle applied in order to maximise force in throwing skills. Explain the biomechanical principle. So simple, just summation of forces, sequence subroutines flowing from the major muscle groups to increase the power and control in the movement action, e.g. throwing a baseball. So 2 marks there, easy 2 marks. Explain which one of the diagrams above better represents the correct timing sequence to maximise summation of force. So I've said diagram 1, that shows more sequenced, evenly distributed movements. There is an even even flow, it's meant to be, from the legs to the wrists. The graph reflects this, again referring to the graph to show you analysis. The graph reflects this showing increased velocity at the wrists. Graph B shows extended duration at the shoulders, resulting in decreased velocity by the time it gets to the wrists. C says, using a sporting example, identify and explain a potential problem in the application of this principle. So I've just used soccer. So poor summation of forces can lead to poor timing and lack of control. So for example, in soccer, if the player does not have the correct and smooth sequence of movement, it may not be able to get the power and control required to beat the goalkeeper. With just the thinking that to get a goal, you've got to really get in particular spots, and it might not have the control or the power to beat that goalkeeper. All right, question 9. So we're looking at tennis. So it's saying a game of complex skills in which a player must make constant changes and adaptations in order to play the ball. So it says this photograph which shows a player in an autonomous stage of learning. Simply describe 3 autonomous stages of autonomous learner. All right, this might be when you get an exam. So I've just said you could look at all the time in the world, smooth and effective technique, able to self-correct error, good anticipation of timing, kinesthetic feedback, deal with external factors, all those sorts of things. B, it says, with reference to a sport of your choice, explain the situation in which an elite player who is in an autonomous stage of learning may revert to the associative stage of learning in some aspects of performance. So I've said if a player reverts to associative, could be that the training does not have game-like pressures. See, for example, opponents, match simulation with scoring, crowd pressure, etc. Practicing under those scenarios may lead them to not be able to cope with these pressures when it comes to competitions, which would reflect the characteristics of an associative learner. C, a tennis coach is attempting to improve the performance of a group of beginning players and a group of elite junior players. Explain one difference in the type of feedback that a coach would give to the 2 different types of group of players. So elite juniors, they might have specific feedback which helps their understanding, their kinesthetic understanding, to help repair techniques. So it might be really key terms that they use, cues that they have to go back to, like talk that might be, quick feet, follow through, roll the wrists, specific things that they have. Beginners would be simple, specific feedback based around major technical advancements that they can practice in a small subroutine. So it might be, step with your left and then hit through, and then grab your racket with the other hand. All right. D says in major tournaments the main court is blue and the surrounds are dark blue or green. Explain one performance in having a contrasting colours for the ball, the court and surrounds. So tennis, dark blue courts, dark green surroundings for green fluoro ball. This allows for increased cue recognition, which would then increase the anticipation of timing for each shot. The stimulus would be enhanced. It would increase the efficiency rate, reducing errors. The tennis umpire and other sports such as golf calls for silence from the spectators during gameplay. Explain the benefit. So this would help selective attention. With sports that have high speed movements, if you reduce the input and the amount of input, they will not be affected by the irrelevant cue recognition. All right, next question. Looking at archery. So it's a precision sport. Same skills might be practiced continuously for long periods of time. Explain one reason, or suggest one reason coaches might use distributed practice rather than mass practice for beginning archers who learn a new skill. So I've said distributed practice has more variation with activities that may help the motivation of the beginner to increase their chances to continue to come back for more sessions. It could look at developing a basis across a range of skills with archery. Again, hitting a range of targets or performing a range of skills, short, long ones. So just things that are going to increase their motivation. B, this is another sporting example to explain how visual feedback may contribute to improvement or more successful performance. Visual feedback gives the learner a picture of what the technique should look like. So this can help with their technique refinement and also aid their mental rehearsal. So in another sport, so cricket is practicing a front foot drive. They may not be getting their feet out far enough. The visual could then really identify and show them how far away their foot would be from where it needs to be. So C, at the Olympic level, an archer must remain absolutely still to maximise the chance of performing the skill successfully. An archer who's very anxious may make unnecessary movements. Explain one way in which an elite archer could control anxiety. So things that can control anxiety could be positive self-talk, mental rehearsal, so visualisation. You can even talk about deep breathing, listening to inspirational, calming movement. But then also things like arriving early to the event, making sure your bag's packed, so all those little anxiety pressures are eliminated. All right. B, after an appropriate warm-up, the experienced shot put competitor completes 2 throws. Here are the 2 techniques. Refer to the diagrams above you, two biomechanical principles which throwing technique is more likely to enable a competitor to achieve maximum distance. So we can see here, this one, hang on. The diagram A is pretty much staying in the front half of the circle, where diagram B is coming from the back of the circle, and you can see the release point in diagram A is a bit flatter than diagram B. So overall, more optimum angle of release and higher point of release, that maximises distance. The more movements with a summation of forces, so it gives more chance to generate more force from that major muscle groups. The shuffle also allowed for momentum in the throw, which would have generated greater velocity. So all sorts of things you could talk about. Using one biomechanical principle, explain the effect that increasing the angle of release beyond 45 degrees would have on trajectory of flight path of the distance thrown. So increasing the angle beyond 45 degrees will reduce the distance thrown, as the flight path would be too steep, which would see gravity take a greater force. The world record for shot put very similar for men and women. Explain one biomechanical principle. Explain how the different weights of shot would account for similar records with men and women. So I've said Newton's second law, so force equals mass times by acceleration. So if we have, men and women generate different amounts of force, so the force is proportional to the mass of the person plus acceleration. Women's shot on average is 3.64 kilos lighter, according to the table. So that would be have been calculated to look at maybe the force generated by a lady is roughly that much lighter. So then if we can get the mass equivalent according to this acceleration, we can generally get the same distance if the woman's shot is a little bit lighter than the men's. And that's Newton's saw, is that the force is dependent on the mass times by the acceleration. All right. So question 4, identify 3 characteristics of a player of cognitive learning. So that's an easy one. Makes lots of errors, cannot identify mistakes, cannot deal with external factors, inconsistent execution, all those sorts of things. Chunking is a technique that is increased to increase the amount of information that can be stored in short-term memory. Explain how a way a coach can use this technique. So I've said in swimming, just giving the player some information that they can utilise in the water. So it could be pick the apple off the tree and put it in the basket. This will help the beginner remember to put their arm above their head and then drag it through the water to the hip to then go again. C, refer to the following diagram. Explain a technique or modification of the rules can affect the input mechanism. So modification of the rules can potentially move external factors that will cause anxiety of errors. Modification can remove options that the player has to process, meaning their selective attention is refined. They can make a clear choice. This will see skill execution rates with less pressure, thus they'll develop more successful subroutines. D, some athletes listen to music through earphones as they warm up or train. This strategy is used to control arousal levels. Explain another strategy. So visualization, calm the anxiety through mental rehearsal, a successful completion of technique, but also those things I talked about in the previous slides about getting to the game early, maybe knowing your track that you're going to run, all those sorts of things. All right. Question 9.